Tonight is going to work as follows. We're going to have some prepared panellist questions that we've thought about and we're going to pose to them. That's going to go on until about 7:20, at which point we're going to open the conversation to the floor. So I know some of you have already thought about questions, but this is my announcement that you've got an extra 40 minutes or so now to think about anything you'd like to ask the panellists. We've got a wonderful roving mic by the name of Tom, all ready and prepared. Here's one we made earlier. And then we're going to do about 30 minutes of questions before closing up. So I'm going to ask my panellists to introduce themselves. We know that everyone has a relationship with citizenship, but I want to ask you to introduce yourself by sharing a little bit about your role and how citizenship comes up most for you in your work, and if you want to share your personal life. Are you happy to open for us, Edie?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me in the back? Mm-hmm. Right. Just to kick off by saying how pleased I am that Liberal Judaism is running such a series, because I think many people are concerned, as Tom has spoken about, the lack of space within the Jewish community to discuss difficult issues. And as we can appreciate, the Jewish community in many ways is quite polarized, as the rest of society is. And I think there's a real fundamental question about where do we get our information from? And I think there's also questions about whether we could expect more from the Jewish press to open up conversations beyond what some might consider quite narrow remits. So I think it's a really fundamental question. So I just want to kick off by saying thank you very much for inviting me, but also for organizing this. If I could just kick off by speaking personally for a moment, and then I'll talk about my work at JCORE. So I'm the director of the Jewish Council for Racial Equality. We try to provide a Jewish voice on race and asylum issues, doing practical work to support asylum seekers and refugees, from befriending to mentoring refugee doctors, and campaign to make sure that legislation is correct and will actually allow asylum seekers to integrate and have the best opportunity to find a place within this society. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But just to speak personally, you could probably tell from my accent that I'm from the United States. I'm an American citizen, though I have lived most of my adult life in the UK, so I'm resident in the UK. And I'm really quite relaxed about that, but I realize that being able to say that is a quite privileged thing. I'm not an asylum seeker or a refugee. I haven't had to flee, though politically the United States in the 1970s was a place that many people thought maybe they ought to flee from. But nevertheless, I can't compare it to other people's experience. And being a resident, not a citizen of the UK, but I am able to participate fully within the political process. I'm an active member of the Labour Party and participate fully in a whole range of things. So in that respect, not having citizenship has not been a negative thing for me in this country. Because I'm an American citizen, I vote in the American elections, which I think is my duty on behalf of the whole world, considering who now sits in the White House. And the one thing that I regret I'm not able to do in this country is vote. And I'm very concerned about the current climate in terms of the rise of demagogues, of nationalism, etc. And as a Jewish person, this obviously causes a great deal of concern. But also as someone who runs the Jewish Council for Racial Equality, that many of the people we work with inevitably are quite vulnerable. And so you have asylum seekers who are not citizens. They do not have certain rights. They're not allowed to work and maintain themselves, which would be a big aid into actually integrating into this country. And being a refugee, you automatically are not in a position, even if you do get citizenship, to be able to fully participate. And with the rise of populism and the rise of the well, it's not really post-Brexit because we haven't done it yet, but that whole world where racial attacks have increased, attacks against Muslims, etc., it's a very frightening time. To end on a very different sort of and very practical note, in terms of refugees, the organization British Future has done some work looking at whether citizenship ceremonies can be an aid to helping people integrate. And at first I thought, ooh, that's a bit strange. But people who have come from war-torn countries to be British and to have that protection of a different nationality is something that I don't understand, but nevertheless is obviously something terribly important. And there are questions about if you have citizenship ceremonies in such a way, can you actually aid and help people to integrate into this country and make it not something that you fear because you have to learn all sorts of rather strange facts that probably most of the population don't know, but nevertheless it can be a very positive and rewarding thing. And so thought has actually gone into, can you use citizenship ceremonies as a way of helping people to integrate and find a place and feel that they are a part of Britain?
Lovely, thank you very much. Tasmine, can I ask you to share a little bit of your thoughts around how citizenship has related to your public life, and if you want to, your private life too?
Well, my wife's from Lithuania, so Brexit looms, really. And in terms of looking at what that means for my particular family, well, we don't know, really. The answer is nobody knows what the medium and long-term consequences of that will be. And on top of that, the children or issue of our family are going to look at where is their future going to be? You know, is there going to be a bet placed upon the UK that it's got a captain that can steer it through choppy waters, or does it have a series of people who can apply for the job of captain that can navigate it through rocky waters? And given that we're on the rocks already, the answer is sort of no, really. But in terms of Europe as well, how has Europe's complexion changed in the run-up to Brexit? Looking at Catalan and the Catalonian issue, and how Spain and Europe have sort of skipped over the ideas of democracy for a greater project, and the fact that there's a rise of the right wing in Europe on a much more urgent basis than in the UK, then that's not looking like a hugely attractive prospect either. And I think it's unfortunate that actually, if we look anywhere in the world, nothing looks particularly attractive when you've grown up in the 80s and 90s with a much more optimistic sort of look on life, and you got through the 90s and into the 2000s, and you think, well, how do we get from a high to a serious depression, really? And where is there a future where there isn't conflict looming anywhere? And in that context, that is where I do the difficult work of representing people who are accused of the most reprehensible crimes. And I think that's probably why that interests me, because how you treat your foe is a measure of who you are, not how you treat your friend. And that is the value system that all states need to consider in order to be able to justify themselves as states. It's the glue that binds us, in that the rule of law, which in the UK, I guess, was established back in the 9th century. Alfred the Great, in his Book of Dooms, but that just meant laws. The fundamental principle there was that the rich man, the poor man, the friend and foe are treated the same. And that draws upon Mosaic law principles in Leviticus and what have you. And these are the concepts that are natural justice for all states to be able to call themselves states that is with any meaning at all. And with respect to the Shamima Begum matter, the issue isn't about citizenship fundamentally. It goes even deeper than that. It goes down to the rule of law itself, in that where a crime is committed, or it's alleged that a crime has been committed, we make it our business to bring that person and make them face justice under the rule of law, with evidence being brought about what the accusation is. We have done this to the worst of our foes, or we have, in the Second World War, we have burnt our nation to the point of annihilation, and yet still afforded our enemy the rule of law, the bringing of evidence against them in order to face a process. We have done that with people who are accused of being ISIS members. We have ministers last year lamenting that there were 400 returnees of men of fighting age who were in organisations that were terrorist organisations. They were back in the UK, and 10% of them had faced courts and justice. So the question becomes, well, how does a 19-year-old girl who's gone out to Syria at the age of 15, by her own admission being groomed, with a child, then end up in a position where she is denied the very fundamental principles that flow from her birth, where she was, in the UK, born, bred, radicalised in the UK, on the basis that a trick of law is applied on her to say that actually no, she's somebody else's problem. And from our point of view, that's human fly tipping. That's taking a problem and dumping it on your innocent neighbour and saying it's now your fault, basically. Quite apart from whether Shamima Begum did right or wrong herself, it's a question of, well, why would we not afford her and our society the right to examine her and ask her what did she do wrong, and apportion the blame and the consequence of that blame precisely. What are we so scared of from a young girl?
Human fly tipping is quite a phrase. That is going to stick with me. Danny, can I ask you to introduce yourself in relation to citizenship, please?
Yes, I'm delighted to do so. Let me say, first of all, as the host for this evening, I'm thrilled that liberal Judaism is once again at the margins in the sense of asking the questions that many of us don't like to ask and certainly won't debate in public. We had a hot potato last month, we've got another one tonight, and no doubt we'll have many more. And so I want to pay tribute to Izzy and Tom and the team here who are putting this series together. Some of you will know that I've been a magistrate for over 20 years in Kingston, and I get invited to citizenship ceremonies every few months. And as I was going to say inactive member of the Labour Party as opposed to an active one, but as a Labour councillor in Barnet, I also get invited to citizenship ceremonies there, and I've never been to one, except 2 weeks ago, one of my own staff here who has changed citizenship asked me to accompany him to a citizenship ceremony. So I went to my first citizenship ceremony at the London Borough of Harrow. The mayor who presided over it was not born in England, and she very proudly spoke of her time in England, her time in Harrow, and her welcome to the borough and its diversity. And what struck me there were 50 people accepting citizenship, and their variety was amazing. And they all wanted one thing in common, for whatever reason. They don't state a reason, but they all wanted their British citizenship, and they pledged loyalty to Queen Elizabeth and her heirs, sang the national anthem, had a nice photograph, and presumably went home again, reassured by something. So that's that. Let me say that despite the fact that many people think I'm very white, middle class, establishment male, all those prejudices which aren't usually acceptable anymore in left-wing organisations, most of my grandparents were not born in this country. So my parents were born in this country. Two of my but as I move further back, they were born primarily in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and elsewhere. So only 2 generations ago, my family, my direct ancestors, were not citizens of the United Kingdom. They were probably citizens of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Polish bit of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, if they were citizens at all, in any sense of the word. And they clearly, oh, by the way, I should just tell you my pedigree does go back to 1760, when somebody arrived in Amsterdam, from Amsterdam here. But overall, 3 of my grandparents were born not in this country. And clearly were not citizens of the United Kingdom until the United Kingdom chose to accept them at some particular point by a naturalisation process. And so Charlotte likes to wheel me out as the sort of refugee who doesn't look like one. One's prejudice of refugee. But it does remind me, from time to time, and I seek to remind audiences, that the United Kingdom is made up, as most other countries are, is made up of refugees. are made up of people who sought citizenship, who weren't born necessarily in the country or didn't have citizenship when they arrived. And one can look at many countries, I mean, excepting small islands, but even bigger islands like New Zealand and Australia, and realise that the indigenous born populations are quite small. And that means there has to have been a concept at some time that people arrived for whatever reason. They may have been sent there by the British penal authorities, if you're Australian. They may have fled, they may have chosen to go there for whatever reason, but they arrived without citizenship of the country, usually, and at some point they or their children after them were accorded citizenship. And it seems to me that there are two ways that one really is accorded citizenship. One is by birth, or used to be by birth, by the way. Used to be that if you're born in the United Kingdom, you automatically had you'll correct me legally if I'm wrong, you automatically had the right to be a British citizen. I believe that's now changed, and you can be born in the United Kingdom and still not be entitled to citizenship. And the other way, of course, was by some application by which you became a citizen because you were not a citizen of the country you were living in. I suppose really on one level citizenship didn't really occur to me. As I said, my two parents were born in Britain. I was born in Britain, so I got the passport without really thinking about it. Hadn't really thought about citizenship per se, except as an old lefty I always assumed I was a citizen of the world, and that in an ideal world we wouldn't need citizenships because people would be able to come and go, and if they found work they'd stay, and if they didn't find work they'd leave. Depends on the benefit system, of course, but primarily. And that people would just, in fact, be human beings. Now, I accept that's not a reality either. It may not be an ideal, and it's certainly not a reality today, that the world is divided into states. And those states accord people citizenship. I suppose I began talking and writing about these issues when, with Charlotte and others, I was rather shocked when we saw mass migration really out of Syria, which was a country that had been quite strong in many ways, was suddenly being internally destroyed by civil war, and large numbers of people were landing on a part of which I also felt a citizen, which was Europe. They were landing on the continent of Europe or in the European Union area, and suddenly these were people who were seeking initially something which we had and they felt they didn't have. They, of course, were primarily seeking simply to live a decent life, to hopefully be reunited with their families, to work, to retire like the rest of us, and to be buried either here or in Syria, wherever they wanted to be buried when the time came. It shocked me, I suppose, that many people seem to be relatively indifferent to the plight of these people, and that as a continent we, and I know accepted whatever the number was very early on, but that somehow this was not a challenge to be overcome, but a problem to be removed. And I think that Turkey was the answer, partly to remove it. If we can if we can persuade Turkey to take people, then we wouldn't have to think about it. And it seemed to me that began, in my mind, to think that an individual's role in any part of the world and an individual's role in their country in which they live, which is preventing other people coming and going, is a moral Jewish question. And I suppose if that's what you want to be as the introduction, because I'm trying to abide by what you asked me to do, then
how unusual.
That's how I got involved.
This is lovely. And ladies and gentlemen, I realise I haven't introduced myself. My name's Charlotte Fischer. I'm part of the senior management team at a charity called Citizens UK. And we're very proud to be a partner with Liberal Judaism, where I work on some of the social justice work that Liberal Judaism does. Now, one of the things that we do at Citizens UK, which people love or don't love, depending on where they're at, is we're quite strict on timekeeping. So, having met our wonderful panellists, and I hope you're enjoying their company as much as I am, I'm going to make an ask, which is, Tom, I'm going to ask for you to be my timekeeper from now on, if this is okay. And everyone after this introduction are going to have 3 minutes to answer. Are we comfortable with this? Great, because we've got a lot to go through. So one of the things that I think has been really interesting in the framing of citizenship recently, and I think citizenship has always been framed, it has not been one concept throughout time, is a debate about whether citizenship is a right or if it's a privilege. And I wanted to pose that question and what your thoughts are to our panellists, beginning, if it's okay, with Tasnime.
Yeah, sure. Citizenship is a lot more of a complex issue in a more complex world. But where it stems from is a concept in Latin called jus sol, like the law from the soil almost, which is so natural in its rawness, is that the idea that you are, because you're born in a place, you are loyalty to the ruler of that place, and they owe a duty to you, to look after you, to keep you safe. And because of that relationship, you have a right, and it's unavoidable. It's just natural to the soil that you're in. There are other ways to get citizenship through marriage or through parentage, but that's the fundamental core principle. That principle goes back time immemorial, really started to change in the 1700s. We had William Blake, who was looking at these issues, and he commented back in those days that previous to that, the only way you could get citizenship was to be born in a country. Even emissaries of the state, if they had children outside the state, would not have citizenship. That was then codified in law. And similarly, people coming to the country could not have citizenship. The only ways for that citizenship to be removed was if you were engaged in treason and you were banished, which goes back even longer than the 1700s, obviously, or if you were engaged in the employ of an enemy prince to the state. So you had to be on treason levels, basically, before you could have that taken away. And that actually stayed pretty much the position, really. There's a little hiccup in the 18th century when for some reason, if you were a woman and you married a non-Brit, then you were automatically had your citizenship stripped. It was a particular time. I think a similar situation in the US. And the Scots had a bit of a rough ride of it in 1701 to 10, where they were switched from alien to non-alien, depending on what Charles was thinking at the time. But beyond that, we get into the complexities really when we're dealing with the breakup of empire, really. So from the 1940s up until the late 60s, we have a raft of legislation that starts defining people as Commonwealth citizens or not, right of vote or not. But that theme throughout, you couldn't have your citizenship stripped unless you were engaged in treason or banishment, really. And that really only changed in really 2002, which was not that long ago. And it changed with an amendment to the Immigration Act, so Section 40 of the Immigration Act. It was driven by one case. It was the Abu Hamza case, really. So here you have a man that the state is looking at and suggesting that there are no criminal laws to deal with him. And so it was tabled an amendment to allow for people who were seen as not conducive to the public good, but who were engaged in behaviour that was against the vital interests of Britain. And they could be stripped of citizenship so long as it didn't leave them stateless. As soon as that law was passed, within 3 days, Abu Hamza was stripped of his citizenship. However, he subsequently won on appeal because he was left stateless. But even then, the question was the vital interests of the state of the UK. That is Guy Fawkes level stuff, basically. At the end of the day, you'd have to be engaging that sort of behaviour before you could even be stripped of citizenship, albeit left with citizenship of another state. Now, the law was changed again in 2006. It was in order to make that even easier to get rid of people. And Tony Blair actually drove this one, where he said he wanted to make the streamlining of the process, make it easier to remove complication from the different sort of definitions. And so instead of having the vital interests being the issue, it now became conducive to the public good, so long as you weren't left stateless. So here we then have a situation where instead of being engaged in Guy Fawkes level or treason level activity, you can have your citizenship struck away. You're now left with a Home Secretary who could make a decision based upon unacceptable behaviour. Now, I don't know if any of you have children, but on any given day there's unacceptable behaviour, really. And really the reason it was watered down to that level was so that the classification of extremist could be applied, which has no real legal definition. And somebody could be labelled as an extremist and therefore potentially have their citizenship stripped. And that was the experience of a fellow called Hilal al-Jeddah. He had the unusual privilege of being stripped of citizenship twice. He was originally stripped in 2007, seen to be left stateless, won his appeal, and within 3 weeks the government had changed the law again, so that the provision of leaving somebody stateless was now not a backstop anymore. So all the Home Secretary has to do for naturalised people, not people who are born in the UK, is to show that they're not contributing to the public good, that they are engaged in some activity that is that is against the vital interests of the UK state, and only has to have a reasonable believe that there are reasonable grounds for believing that the person could apply for citizenship in another country. So it could be left stateless, but with the option to apply somewhere, which is quite a, that's just quite a step forward. And that's where we found ourselves now, at a place where, in Europe and the UK, where politically we're at the foothills of the 1930s in terms of political discourse. We've also eroded our concept of the rule of law and concept of citizenship to the point where if we don't, if the tabloid press doesn't like you, bad things can happen to you if it's politically expedient. And that's a very worrying proposition, particularly when the law has been changed around just a handful of individuals, but it has such an impact upon literally millions of people right now.
I'm going to intervene for two things. One is I'm going to take control of timekeeping because I am less lovely than the very lovely Tom. So at the end of 3 minutes, you are going to hear a knock on the table. No, but we were talking about this before, and you made a point, Tasnime, about the danger of a framing around extremism and what then happens in our public debate when it's easier to label other people. Can I ask you to expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So earlier on we were talking about the fact that the legislation was changed with this in order to accommodate the label of extremism, to say if you're an extremist or you've been defined as an extremist, however that's defined, then you can have your citizenships taken away. Now, there are some positive benefits to that. Right? That's not all negative. It means that through our immigration laws, we can block people who are known agitators from other countries to coming into the UK, really. The problem becomes when it's reversed, when you're taking somebody's very ability to eat, sleep, have family relations away on the basis of a ill-defined term. And in the context of where we are, in the context of this discussion, and the issue where we have, let's say, the BDS movement on one hand, throwing stones or labels up at the other side in terms of Israeli lobby, and Israeli lobby throwing stones back, both sides are calling each other extremists. They're doing this on social media, they're doing this all, in tabloid press or in normal press even. That label sticks. Doesn't matter who's throwing that label around. And in that situation, you can find that this type of legislation will catch people indiscriminately and randomly in that crossfire. And this is why having labels that are ill-defined in law is a very dangerous precedent. In terms of extremism itself as an idea, it's sort of predicated on the idea of the end of history, really, in that we have a norm that will not change, and anything on the fringes of that norm is extreme. Now, as we know in the UK, women didn't have the right to vote in 1918. We looked at homosexuality in a very different way in the 1960s as we do today, in the exact opposite phrase. There is no such thing as the end of history. There's no such thing as the end of a defined norm. And so to have this fringe definition, which is always sliding, as a reason to be able to exclude somebody from their fundamental rights, I believe is extremely dangerous.
That framing of the value of extremists is something Barack Obama writes about too in his book. He says that we often use it as a negative, but sometimes zealots were on the right side of history. Sometimes the women's movement or other movements, the movements that were extreme, were actually the ones that we look back on and say are valuable. And he says he is robbed of his certainty even in uncertainty. Danny, can I come to you to talk about privilege or right? You've gone to these ceremonies, you've had a look at what it feels like. Do you think of citizenship as privilege, as right, as something else?
Well, let me just try and reflect upon it in a Jewish sense, first of all. In my extensive preparation, 10 minutes before we began, I thought, well, what does the Bible say about citizenship? And of course, the very famous phrase is that of Jeremiah, who says, "Seek the welfare of the city in which you dwell." And Jeremiah, of course, was an exile. Jeremiah is living in Babylon. He and all of the people he associates himself with, his tribe, if I use that term, his people, have been mass exported by the authorities to somewhere else. And in fact, as we eventually know, of course, when the time came for them to return to their homeland, many of them remained, and hence we had the very strong Iraqi Jewish community rose out of Babylon. But he says, seek the welfare of the city for two reasons. One, he says, because if you pray for its well-being, you will get well-being in return. So essentially, that's saying something about by trying to be loyal to the place in which you live, it will reward you. And by the way, the rabbinic comment is you have to seek the welfare of the government, because otherwise, rather like Thomas Hobbes, I think it was Thomas Hobbes, everybody will eat everybody else unless the state exists. So in some sense, the establishment of a state to which you are loyal, or a city whose welfare you must pray for, comes out of that. What is the well-being of you and the society in which you live? And I think that's the starting point. And interestingly, it was taken out when a Jew, it was said by a Hebrew prophet when he was already in exile. Of course, citizenship is a major controversial issue for Jews, which it may not be for other peoples. I mean, it may be, it may not be. But for Jews in particular, it's associated with the modern state of Israel on the one hand, and associated with the absence of being allowed to be citizens in many of the so-called civilized Christian and Muslim countries of the world until relatively recently. So that is the background in which citizenship is a controversial concept in what it means to be a Jew. I would say, wouldn't I, because I'm a liberal, that it's neither A nor B. That rather like the Hebrew Bible says you have rights and responsibilities, so citizenship is both a privilege and a right. Now, can it be both? And how can it be both? And in what way can you take away somebody's right, or you can take away somebody's privilege by legal means or any other means? It is a matter for debate and detail. But in essence, it seems to me that if you're born in a country, logic would say, going back to one of its original legal meanings, you have the right to citizenship of that country. How you then behave and retain that citizenship may partly be a privilege.
Yes, indeed. Today, the Home Office, at the moment, if you're born in the UK, if you're a child born to non-British parents and you live to the age of 10, you have a right to be British, but you have to pay over £1,000. And it's resulting in a situation where a lot of the member families that I'm working with are in a situation where the school is saying to the parent, basically, we're in an impossible position. You have to pick which of your children do you think has the best chance of getting into university and pay for them, because you need your citizenship papers to get home fees, right? They're not a citizen of any other country, and parents are put in this impossible position. And last week, the inspector wrote to the Home Office and said he recommends the abolition of fees, and today the Home Office announced they would not review it. But on that theme, going back to Jeremiah around what are the responsibilities of what does it mean to be seeking the welfare of your city. And Edie, you made a joke about you feel responsible to vote in the American elections. I wanted to explore a little bit about what are the responsibilities of citizenship, both from the state to the person, and also what are our responsibilities as citizens to the state. Can I ask you to open with that?
Well, just to carry on from Jeremiah, if I can. I mean, one statement that we often use is it good for the Jews? And I think it would be far better if we would ask the question, is it good for all of us? And I fear, is it good for the Jews is something that is growing, in a sense, that whole thinking. And it feeds back into that, because Jewish people, like any group of people, have to be active citizens. They have to pass that Jeremiah test, which I terribly important. Also, to pick up from a previous comment, there was this infamous comment made by our Prime Minister about if you're not, and I'm maybe paraphrasing, so do please correct me, but if you're not a citizen of a particular country, you're a citizen of nowhere. And then I think that also has profound questions about, well, if you're not, I mean, I think it's quite pernicious, but other than that, if you're a citizen of nowhere, then do you not have any responsibilities to do anything anywhere because you don't belong? And I think that it has profound consequences for your ability to integrate into society, to be a part of that society, to help that society. But we also have to remember that citizenship is very much something that's a very arbitrary thing. The late and very much missed Rabbi Hugo Gwynn used to joke that he lived in 4 or 5 countries, but he never moved. And I think, such is the way of the world, that this is, very much...
Would you just explain how Hugo lived in 4 or 5 countries and never moved?
Well, because where he lived pre-Holocaust, the countries kept changing. So it was the Hungarian Empire, it was this, and I'm sorry, but I don't know the exact change of countries, but nevertheless, that was his experience, as it was probably for not only Jewish people, but for many people pre-Second World War. But whether it's a right or a privilege, I think the state has a responsibility to do things that actually aid citizenship. And as part of that, if you are poor, if you are poorly educated, your ability to actually participate in society will be very much curtailed. And I think we need to think about, when we're thinking about citizenship, we need to think about social and economic rights. And as there is growing inequality in this country, this will fundamentally affect many people's ability to actually participate. So these definitions of a right or a privilege, they get, in a sense, muddled up because we have to go back to basics. And so finally, to say that we need political education, which I think this sort of event is, and political education for children and for adults, so that we can actually have a better and more profound understanding of these issues. And finally, to say that citizenship should never be used as a weapon. And clearly we have seen citizenship being used as a weapon.
Danny and Tasnime, what are your thoughts about the responsibility of citizenship?
They do. It comes back to, is it a right and is it a privilege, really? And if you do it on a very basic level, if you're born somewhere, it's your right. If you've come to somewhere and are going through a process of naturalization, that's always been seen as more of a privilege. And so when it comes to naturalization, there are caveats to that in terms of being of good character, being usually a condition in many places, and then learning the language and various other aspects. But even if you're naturalized, in the law now, there is a distinction between the quality of your citizenship if you came to it through naturalization or if you came to it through birth. Unfortunately, Shamima Begum there's an argument about that. But and even then you split it down further into where are your parents from. So were they naturalized or do they have citizenship from somewhere else? And we end up with this rainbow pattern of different qualities and grades of citizenship, with all the responsibilities that are expected from every grade of citizen to the state, but with a very different feedback relationship and set of rights that come from the government. So, for example, if I were indigenous to the UK and I were to commit a crime, I would go to court. Rule of law applies, be found guilty, and go to prison. And that would be the end of that. But if, however, that crime was serious enough to warrant, let's say, a 1-year custodial sentence, and I wasn't in that category of being indigenous to the UK, or I'd been naturalised here, I could lose my citizenship and be deported to another country. So that then, the citizenship argument there, becomes more problematic because it then has the consequential effect of looking at a 2-tiered justice system, really, where one punishment for one individual because of their ethnicity, another punishment for another individual or a double punishment for the other individual because of that. And so on the criminal justice side, it has that impact, but also in terms of what is being a citizen really, depending on where your parents are from, that is a two-tier, or arguably a two-tier, sort of quality of citizenship. So, you know, if my parents were somewhere else and I could theoretically in the future lose my citizenship, do I have to pay the same level of taxation, really? I mean, you know, where is that proportionality, that risk then, you know, hedged in terms of the responsibilities back? So it's complicated. It's gets even more complicated when you have dual nationals, really, in terms of what is the precedent in terms of who takes responsibility. And frankly speaking, these sort of issues need to be grappled on a case-by-case basis. But the problem that we have is that at the moment, and I think this is maybe global, unfortunately, we have a system where people and governments are looking at things on an interest basis. On every single situation, it's what interest do we want, what do we want out of it. We're not looking at things in terms of a value system, really. And if we don't start operating on a value system, we erode the very principle of citizenship, the very glue that binds us together. In that, in a value system, to give an example, if you're at war and you have an enemy and you shoot your enemy, because of who we are, we treat that person back to health, really. But on an interest-based system, you shoot your enemy, you leave them to die. The problem then becomes, well, how do your allies look at you? How can they trust what you're going to do if you're operating purely on an interest basis rather than a value basis? And the overall game theory is that actually the ones who win out in the longest term are the societies that operate on value systems rather than interest systems.
Wonderful. And I want to ask two questions. Do you want to say anything about that, Danny?
I do.
Go for it. You've got 3 minutes.
Well, the first thing is, I think actually all individuals have moral responsibilities, and I'm a bit concerned sometimes when there's a distinction made between born people and people who don't have a citizenship having different responsibilities. They all have responsibility to behave properly. If you're only a British citizen, you break the law, you go to prison, or whatever the punishment is. I have to say that I have some sympathy with those who argue if you come into this country as a visitor, or as a refugee, or anything else, if you're not a citizen, then you should abide by the laws of the country, and if you don't, you should be deported. When I go to Saudi Arabia, if I get drunk, I expect to be, not that I use Saudi Arabia.
When you regularly go to Saudi Arabia.
Well, I visit Saudi Arabia for all sorts of reasons. But were I to, you know, if there are cultural norms in the society, now then some of them may be so oppressive that you're prepared to resist them, but then there are also certain responsibilities that you have. Sometimes when I hear about British tourists who've gone naked up to some holy shrine of some other people and stood outside and taken a photograph and then moan when they get into trouble, I can't say I'm greatly sympathetic with them. You know, there is a sense in which we all have a responsibility to behave properly. That begins by learning something, whether we're going from Britain somewhere else or vice versa. British culture is no better or worse than any other one, and maybe in a general rule. We have some responsibility to understand that culture and not be deeply offensive, possibly, to the people who live there. Now, I agree, if you go as a pioneer and campaigner, that's a different matter. If you go as an individual tourist, for example, you might need to control what you yourself about what you can do in one country to what you can do here. And I think we haven't quite teased that out enough, because I wouldn't punish somebody, I might just deport them, so they wouldn't be double punished.
Sure.
If you're a Brit, you go to prison. If you're not a Brit, you get deported. So they're different punishments to suit, arguably. So I wouldn't double punish people. I agree not double punishing people, but it might be different punishments, which sounds a bit illogical on one level. But I'm just not sympathetic to people who travel to other people's cultures and then want to trash all over them. I'm not suggesting in any cases that we've heard about today that's the case, but I think that's a factor we need to think about. Makes it more complicated.
Yes, although the case you're making is about the obligation to obey the law of the land, as opposed to why is citizenship different, right? So if we're thinking about if someone's not a British citizen, you might deport them, fine. But the question is, what if they are a British citizen but they could not be? And why is citizenship so much more important as a basic right that we can build a whole set of other rights?
Because I think citizenship involves rights and obligations.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a British citizen, you expect the state to do things for you, which
Right.
if you're not a citizen, you don't have the state doesn't have necessarily is required to do it.
So it is about a mutuality that, about rights and responsibilities. And that's how I would look at it.
Can I pick up on that in regards to the Jewish community? Because there's two things that I think are universal, but the Jewish community has particular experiences of. One is, I'm thinking about post-Brexit Jews who have regained citizenships that were stripped from their families in previous generations, and what that relationship is like to reclaim a citizenship that was stripped from you. I am one of those Jews. And the other is the question about your potential for other nationalities. Obviously has significance for lots of groups, but it has particular significance for a number of Jews who can claim right of return under the laws of Israel. And I wanted to ask your reflections. I'm going to ask all three of our panellists, and then we may open it up for the floor. But either your reflections on those more generally, but also what is happening for the Jewish community in those situations, and what are the things we need to be thinking about and reflecting on and dealing with. Edie, are you happy to open that?
Yes. I mean, I like to see Jewish people all over the world. So I think, and if Jews, so if Jewish people end up in places where they had, met death and destruction during the war, then in a sense we were reclaiming it. And I think that can be thought of as a very positive thing. And I'm not one who believes that every Jewish person should go to Israel. And I like and hope that Jewish communities can thrive any place. I think there are really thorny questions about, dual loyalty, divided loyalty, and it's because of what other people think about these things, rather than just the person who may have this dilemma. But there's an awful lot of baggage, and no matter how long we have been in this country, we were talking before that today some member of the Brexit Party was asked to, not asked, that's the wrong word, I think was kicked out because they talked about the Miliband brothers, Ed and David and Mandelson, is why do we have to listen to these people with such shallow roots? Well, that really, I think, goes to the nub of the question, and made the infamous remark by Norman Tebbit many years ago about the cricket test. So I think there are, and I don't know if people remember, but which side do you root on and things. And so I think we have so much of this now with George Soros being, reeled out, the thought of him, the idea of him all the time. So I think we have some really tricky questions over this. And Brexit, and the man who perhaps sort of gave us Brexit, who now sits in his shed. I just wish there had been more reflection about the great sort of storm that has really erupted, and certainly this storm has touched the Jewish community, I think, greatly. But let us think about it in positive ways as well, that maybe this is giving us the opportunities to engage with things that we have shied away from in the past, and certainly how we handle this whole question about divided loyalty and Israel. And just finally, because Palestinians, Israelis, and Jews outside of Israel, we all, in a sense, occupy, and perhaps occupy isn't the right word, but we occupy the same space. And I think we need some really very fundamental and new conversations between ourselves of how we're going to negotiate that if we're going to move forward. So that's, I think, another aspect, because there are some tricky things about, Palestinians also have rights of citizenship to places that Jewish people claim rights of citizenship.
And perfect to 3 minutes as well, so we've clearly built it into our habit. Danny, your reflections on the Jewish community and both reactions to taking other citizenships post-Brexit, but also what some of the principles that came alight in the Shamima Begum case means for Jews around the possibility that they can get other citizenships and how that affects their British citizenship.
So I think the biggest problem is about assumptions. I'm a British Jew. That doesn't say anything about my relationship to Israel, if I have one. And if somebody wants to know, they should have the courtesy to ask me rather than assume. Now, for some people, Israel, they may feel it to be the centre of their life, and one day they intend to go there. That's how some Jews think about Israel. Fine. Others think about it, I could flee there tomorrow if I've applied for citizenship, I can get it. And for others, it is a religious, spiritual, even peoplehood centre, but it's not where my citizenship is. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to stop people making assumptions. Ask me what I think about Israel, or about Palestine, or about the Netanyahu government, or about how Palestinians should be treated, or the fact that I've supported a Palestinian state, and so on and so on. Ask me those questions if you want to know, and don't make assumptions. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think and the dual loyalty, by the way, is a anti-Semitic trope that goes back centuries, and some people on the left are naive and don't understand, and need to learn and understand what that means, or why it's offensive for Jews in this country to be poked with that type of dual loyalty stick. And we also need to learn something about the fact that we can live in multiple. Today, I look at younger people today, and they don't fit into the boxes that everybody wants to put them into. So why should older people? Younger people get away with it by saying, we don't fit into your boxes that you older people want to put on us. And I'm saying, as an older person, I don't want to fit into the boxes that everybody else wants to put me into either. So I can be a supporter of Israel and a supporter of the Palestinians. I can be Jewish and have no connection with Israel. I can be Jewish and still believe that Israel is my homeland. And I can be Muslim and have an affiliation with Pakistan. Or I can be Muslim and be deeply offended by things that Pakistan are doing. And I can be Hindu and British and support the Indian cricket team. We don't need to put everybody into that says, if you have all these things, you have to line up with all these other things. And so I think that's the bigger challenge for us today. As to people reclaiming their citizenship, if I could, I would claim a European citizenship, but the Poles won't let me, I don't think. I'm not particularly sure I want to be a Polish citizen, really. I have to say that I'm very happy with my British citizenship. Interesting enough, not that I use this as a protest of my loyalty, my grandfather fought for Britain in the First World War against German Jews, by the way. My father fought for the Royal Air Force in the Second World War. So I've never been asked to fight for my country, by the way. But I am asked to. I believe I'm fighting for my country with everything that I do. Every breath I fight for my country, because I believe in the decency of British society, and I believe in the decency that British society could contribute to Europe if we were allowed to stay in, about which I'm an advocate, and to the world. I don't think the United Nations is a perfect organisation, but we need to be in it if we've got values we can put into it.
Tasnime, I realise I'm putting you in the middle of a Jewish community. We use the word broigus, like the kind of internal fight you only have with people that you're in community with, the kind of people that your mother remembers still didn't turn up for the wedding 20 years ago. But
there are synergies.
Yeah. Danny referred to that idea, ask me. The current British state law does not ask whether you consider yourself potentially an Israeli citizen. It says something about if you are eligible for it anyway, and your client was very publicly in the news about that. Is there anything you'd want to say to a group of British Jews that are thinking about this tonight on that basis?
Well, I think this is the dishonesty of government, I think, in that not only does it not ask, it doesn't like it when it gets the answer from the Supreme Court, which is when in 2002, 2006 and 2014, these undesirables won their cases, instead of the government accepting that this is the rule of law and these are the judges that are tasked with telling us what's right and wrong, they changed the law to say that what was wrong was now right, and let's start that process again. And that's fundamentally dishonest in terms of government at the end of the, or anyone who plays the games to say, well, we're going to ignore the answer just by gaming the actual legislation. So.
Can I interrupt? Sure.
I don't know if you ever asked permission for that, Danny. Go right ahead.
I'm not sure that I want 7 old Cambridge, I'm being prejudicial here, 7 old Cambridge and Oxford educated buffers who happen to think they know a lot about the law and be professional.
They might be old people who also don't like being put on a box,
I'm
Danny.
using it as a prejudice. I'm using a prejudice to make the point. We live in a democracy, and therefore, if the Supreme Court interprets the law in a particular way, don't we as a people, through our parliament, have the right to change that?
No, I agree with that in terms of fundamentally. However, when we also used to have a principle of double jeopardy, that you put somebody through the mill in terms of a criminal prosecution. If they're found not guilty, then you have to stick with it unless there's new evidence or anything. What's happening to certain individuals here was, the optics of it. That the fact is that they'd gone through 6 years or 5 years of fighting a case, been put through the mill, and instead of that person's life being left alone because it's all been decided, then the game was changed around them and then put through that process again. So the impact of an immigration type or citizenshipping is often far worse than a criminal prosecution. In one case, there's no end to it potentially, given the history. In others, there's a finite limit. And so I think it's not so much that we have this buffeting of democracy versus the legislature, or the lawmakers versus the law deciders, but we have a dishonesty fundamental, which is apparent in the behaviour, and that's where the rub is. In that, if the Jewish community needs to ask itself, do we trust our government to apply this law in a way that it should be applied? Well, the answer is no community can trust this government or the history of the governments to actually apply that law fairly and justly with proportion. They can't. You have to rely on a judicial process at the end to call that into question. And what's happened here in terms of the Shamima Begum case is this is a very unique scenario, hopefully a unique scenario, but a very limited scenario where a person finds themselves abroad whilst this decision is being made. And that has a massive consequence. Her child died because of it, rather than finding yourself technically stripped of some citizenship and limited in terms of your movement outside the country, but being left outside in the cold when you're in transit. That's a very different prospect.
I should say I supported the specific case. Indeed. I was thinking about the general idea that somehow, that lawmakers, so the law interpreters, may be wrong or may be right. I mean, I think sometimes the Supreme Court makes rather bizarre decisions. And it seems to me, therefore, it's sometimes, I'm not thinking about on immigration in particular, but in general, where sometimes it might be right that the Parliament says, well, this is how the justices believe the existing law is to be played out. We want to change the law. Seems to me a perfectly legitimate thing to do.
I completely agree with that. And in terms
not about individuals.
If we want to look at wrongs or rights and which institution you trust more or less, then we will find ills on both sides. But in terms of, in this immigration context, in terms of citizenship and trust for the future...
And then on that, I would trust lawyers more than politicians on immigration.
It's quite a worrying proposition.
Yeah.
And on that statement by a politician, can I open the questions to the floor? So am I right in thinking we want people to raise their hand and then Tom will come around with a... Perfect. Now is your moment, ladies and gentlemen.
So I wanted to ask a question. It's a few people you've talked about getting citizenship, if you like, through your ancestry. And Tasnime, a bit like you, I've got family who are, my sons are married to European women. And actually, I think it would be much more valuable if the citizenship that the living can have is of their descendants, not of their ancestors. So, as Danny says, doesn't want Polish citizenship, but we might want the right to seek citizenship of the living. And I just think it'd be a really interesting thing to see if we could change.
That's what does exist to a degree in terms of dependence. So if you have dependent families, members abroad, then there is a there's a process whereby you can bring them over within a certain criteria and have them naturalised.
But isn't it only one generation?
Yeah.
So I'm talking about the grandparents. But seriously, I think it's about living, it's not about the dead. And it would be really interesting to see whether it would be more natural justice to look forward rather than backwards.
I think the problem with that is Ryanair, really, which is that allows for a fluidity of movement, which would open the floodgates to a particularly, let's say, wealthy environment. So you'd have people going there, giving birth. That is what the Americans are grappling with at the moment in terms of or have been, with sort of, they claim that Mexicans are running over to give birth on American soil, and thereby have a sort of anchor whereby they can drag other family members through devices. So,
on the other hand, it does seem to me cruel that you see particularly I've seen in Asian families, they've been here 2 generations, they all live here, the children have now been born in, even the grandchildren, and there's a grandmother left somewhere who has to fend for herself because somehow the immigration authorities won't let her come in because she's going to be, going to cost us a fortune. Well, she costs us less than one weapon, I should think, on anything that's fired. But I mean, that's not the issue. The issue is we should be supporting family unity in some sense. And I realise that's a theoretical floodgate because everybody could say I've got a granny in India or Pakistan or Israel or anywhere else. But it does seem to me that somehow the Home Office seems unable, by seeking to be judicial and they would say fair, or they might not say fair, I think they wanted to be harsh, didn't they, was the word? They seem unable to be compassionate. And that seems to be the biggest challenge. How can we have a Home Office system, if that's the right system, immigration system, which, yes, abides by law, has rules and laws that you have to follow, but can say without massive problem that sometimes we need to be compassionate?
Well, our Home Office implemented a policy called hostile environment as a policy. That hasn't changed, really.
It's got worse.
So when there is a certain generation, let's say, that grew up at a certain time, which look at compassion and humanity and the concept of family as being the smallest unit of society and civilization. And I think we've got a society now that looks at the individual and interest as a more important consideration, and being, defining others as hostile, or hostile to others as our policy framework. And I think that's where we have a problem.
Can I just add that, one of the big refugee campaigns at the moment is the right to family reunification. And, there was all sorts of concerns that unaccompanied children here are not allowed to be joined by any family member, and if they were, then their chances of integrating and becoming successful in terms of taking control of their own lives would be enhanced if they were able to be joined by a family member. But going back, I think we have to continually ask what's the responsibility of the state to actually aid citizenship. And so, if you get refugee status, all of a sudden, overnight, you are not equipped with all the tools you need to actually be able to integrate into this society, to be able to find out about the college you want to go to or the job that you want to have. And we have to constantly put the onus back. And that doesn't mean that we don't have responsibility as well, but we have to constantly hold the government to account to make sure that they are putting in place things that are going to make citizenship and integration and all the things that go with it a possibility that's going to be ultimately successful. Because if you don't, then you pay for it in other sorts of ways. So it's, these things are constantly before us, and we have to battle with them all the time. But we can't give up. And also, finally, to say that people who are citizens because they were born here, but they also have responsibility as well. And for people to say, I'm not political, well, everybody's political, because not being political means you are taking a stand on something. So I think this is part of the political education, which I think we need to step up much more within the Jewish community, that we all have this responsibility to engage, because non-engagement means you are actually letting things happen that should not happen by your indifference or sitting on the fence. So all of these things are dynamic all the time, and I think we have to engage with this hopefully dynamic thing.
Thank you. There was another hand up.
Hello. I think I'll be three Eastern minutes.
I haven't started timekeeping the audience yet, but let's say never.
Of course. The debate is wonderful. The expertise and references are quite familiar, I think, to non-Jewish people of the empire, because they're not particularly experiences. And there's a reason for that. And the fact that we have this debate not so much liberal Judaism, but nationally, is for me a great worrying sign. Because the fact that we have to debate, which I never heard when I was young at school in Barnet and North London many years ago, about citizenship. And I'll tell you why. Because Britain had an empire, in the case of non-Jews, the Jewish people, this is very relevant, over almost half the earth, claiming taxation, promulgating laws, and saying people are subjects with certain forms of citizenship. In this in the case of Shamima Begum, but this applies to the Jewish migration. And it seems that the social experiment to create individuals that started with Thatcher has been very beneficial for the far right and the far left racists in creating people, unless you're of course Anglo-Saxon, as individuals with no history. But the reality of this country, traditional country with conservatism, that in some fictitious laws 1,200 years ago claims in the Momentine laws that any foreign subject has a right to public maintenance. So it has a tradition in this country, 1,200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, of dealing with foreigners, which is often not quoted, unless of course you're a professor of Anglo-Saxon history on TV from somewhere else in London. And this is my point, that most, let's say, Commonwealth immigrants in the Windrush scandal were British subjects paying taxes and considered citizens. They were begged to come to this country.
Right.
Many volunteered. This is very relevant to Jewish people.
I'm with you. I'm no timekeeping, but can I ask you to get to your question?
No, you see the question. Because you can't ask these kind of simplistic questions on a subject matter that I think the base nationally is racist to Jews and Muslims. We should have to say that, because this goes somewhere within 5 years or 7 years. So the principle of people who are British being begged to come to this country, fighting for Britain voluntarily, or Jews in the Paris settlement being brought over by Jewish activism at the highest levels, when laws to normalize Jewish presence in the 1800s were established, makes me feel that this is not about rights and obligations, which are pretty well defined and known in a modern society, but this is about the responsibility of a nation, a diverse nation, a state, of it's dealing with its own legal, economic, and physical history with Eastern European Jews and with the Commonwealth. Windrush expresses this perfectly. And as soon as we debate the notion of rights and obligations in isolation of that, we are foreign eternally. And this is very unusual, because this clearly supports the far right and in fact the far left's attitude to patronizing people who've probably been here, in my case, 7 generations. Because, the British Empire was a legal entity. So my point for Jewish, liberal Judaism and the Jewish community is that there's a great historical forgetting. I don't think we owe anyone anything except that you live according to your values, according to the rule of law, within which is your personal nature, whether you contribute a lot or not. As soon as that notion, which I grew up with, is removed, you are second or fourth class citizens intrinsically, and it will become more and more apparent over time that will be manipulated by many types of forces. It could be anyone, to de-citizen everybody, probably including Scottish people eventually. And this is my question in terms of all the discourses about the Jewish history, the Bible, the Quran, and the way that Joseph and his brothers were invited to Egypt and then enslaved. That the history has an impact on our attitudes to how we deal with citizenship. But we should look at British history and the British elite and historical Anglo-Saxon role, particularly they call it Anglo-Saxon Celtic, in dealing with foreigners, citizenship, taxation, and their duty of that establishment towards its citizens and asylum seekers that have contributed greatly, and that should not be regarded in any form as foreign in any way, regardless of crime.
Right. So am I understanding, I'm going to paraphrase your question, if you're saying discussing citizenship and British citizenship specifically without talking about all the ways that lots of British citizens became citizens through colonialism, through being asked to come, right, you have to talk about it. We can't talk about it in isolation because it's part of what it means to be a British citizen. Right. Any responses from the panel?
Well, I'll say that if you look at the immigration laws from roughly 1945 on to 1967, that's exactly what happens there. In that different countries have different statuses in terms of Commonwealth and what have you, and they're given different categories of citizenship or right of abode or not, and that then evolves beyond into 1960, I think 1 and 5, where even the Commonwealth citizens then start going through a process of chromatography as to whether or not their actual travel documents were issued by the UK state or whether they were by governorships, and then differentiated in terms of whether immigration control applied to one or the other and how many years you had to be resident to stay. But this is a political issue. Citizenship, who is a citizen at the end of an empire, is a highly political issue. When you're talking about the allocation of resources or who you have responsibilities to, when the taxation systems aren't perceivably going to be coming back in on the same proportions. So, on one view, if you look at the UK and it's taken all the resources from all over the world and it owes a duty to its citizens, that's fine in theory. But then if those people then want to collect later, there's no pot left, really, all at the same time. And so these different immigration rules or laws were passed in order to try and slow that process down. That is a problem that states grapple with and continues to grapple with. Do ask the Irish about that, just in Brexit alone, really. That's a major issue. But in terms of where all of these ideas come from about citizenship and who we are and where we belong, that's a much more fluid and problematic concept right now. I mean, if we want to talk about problems where it comes from the right wing, frankly, white working class people are not integrated into this country. They are the lowest on the metrics of any standard. So where our British government has failed to integrate its own indigenous people, when we as different groups who are looking out for our particular groupings, that is right and proper. This is the tapestry of what the UK is. But it also leads to resentment to the indigenous population when they feel that they're on the lowest metrics and they're not engaging, or for whatever political reasons they're not able to engage. And so that mal-feeling then spills over into a right-wing agenda with a particular type of politic, really. And I think that's something that as there are community leaders, we should also be mindful of, where we're asking for recognition. There should also be the recognition of our neighbours to make sure they're not hungry as well. And if you don't have that, you will have resentment. And any charity organisation will know that. When an organisation will go into another country to look after a particular body of people, from experience, it's necessary to look after people who are outside of your particular cause in order to smooth that process over. That basic charity principle is not happening in the UK.
Can I just add, I think that's about the same as my point about social and economic rights, that if we're going to extend those to people who are coming here, we have to make sure that everybody has access to those, because we all need to be good citizens, whether we come from Poland or Nigeria or we were born in Cleckheaton. These things, and you're absolutely right. If we don't do that, then we're inviting resentment and hostility and possibly Brexit and other things. I think there's a particular challenge, and to go back to something that Danny was talking about, is what do we do about refugees? Britain thinks that it is the most generous country, but the fact is certainly it isn't the most generous country. But nevertheless, compared to other countries, and certainly the way the United States has turned its back on the whole concept of refuge now, we have to think seriously about what do we make of refugees? How do we make them citizens? How do we have some sort of just system that helps them integrate? How do we have a just system that means that we take our so-called fair share of refugees like other countries? So there's all sorts of really difficult issues that we have to constantly debate and analyze together, and hopefully in a more positive way than we're currently doing.
I just had a comment. I think you weren't here at the beginning when I talked about the fact that in my view, all countries are made up of immigrants for all sorts of reasons. Some of them have been invited, some of them arrived here, a few of them happen to have been born here. I don't think there are many monocultural countries left where everybody was born there. In other words, we see exchanges of peoples over the generations, over the centuries. And you're right, history is important, but the danger is that history, that sometimes people are so embedded in their history they can't actually see the present or the future. And I know it's not the point you're making. I'm just making a slightly different point. I sometimes think about the Israel-Palestine issue, and I think actually we just have to accept there are two narratives and two stories which are different. and move on from there. And maybe the one has more power than the other at this point and so on. But to spend one's time saying, you did this to me 5 years ago and I did that to you 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I'm not accusing you of saying that at all. Don't worry. So I just think sometimes history is important. We need to understand how we get here, but we also need to deal with the reality of where we are today and where our global world is going tomorrow. I know you
probably talk. That's not maybe I can explain myself. My point is the state.
Yeah.
My point is it's not about Israel, Palestine, or anything else. As people in Britain who are prepared to come here, or invited as a result.
That's part of history.
Activism, that system, all people that came afterwards in 1800. I'm just throwing that out. There's other histories as well. That's the history of Britain.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you remove that on the fear that makes us, all of us, anybody, more foreign, I think that's wrong. Because it's the obligation of the polity, which has raised taxation and done many things to bring that on this earth.
I agree.
Towards its citizens, not in my opinion, because this is a racialized discourse, and non-white people, that's come out globally. And that's really what's happening. And that's a German attitude to citizenship until a few years ago, not a British attitude. And this is my only point, that people should have the citizenship, regardless of whether they're a criminal. Otherwise, half the prisons in this country would have to be deported to Australia, but they can't do that anymore. And so my point is that the responsibility of the polity and the power of the state towards the citizens is more important than the responsibility of the citizens to the state.
Thank you. Jane, you had your hand up.
It's a little bit of a challenge for Danny, I'm afraid.
That's his favourite thing.
So
you're doing very well with the challenge.
This is around the not doubly punishing people, but giving different punishments. If somebody's found guilty, some people might go to prison, others might have their British citizenship revoked because they can have citizenship elsewhere. But citizenship, I can't even say it, isn't equal. And the rights that you have in different countries as a citizen are quite different. So, for example, as a female, if your other citizenship was, say, in Saudi Arabia, your rights would be quite different. If you were a gay person and your other citizenship was Uganda, your rights would be quite different. So I think we treat taking citizenship as being just a thing, and it's not. It's many things in many countries.
I think that's a perfectly fair point. But I still, and there may be exceptions where you all punishments are part. Every time I have to give a sentence, I hear a probation report. So it might be that it's not appropriate to send a single woman back to Saudi Arabia because of discrimination against women in Saudi Arabia. I accept that completely. But the point that I was really making was that everybody has an obligation to be a decent person and leave other people alone unhindered. The challenge is if I go to another country where I don't have any automatic right, I haven't even paid my taxes, and turn up as a tourist, and frankly, I don't know, take my clothes off at some holy site, maybe I should be thrown out of the country, not because I've committed any heinous crime, actually. I mean, I don't care about idols and whether I'm naked. Well, actually, being naked for me might be a heinous crime, but in a general sense, it's just that there is some obligation, I think, on both citizens and non-citizens, by the way, to behave properly. But I think when I go abroad, I think in a way I need to behave. I need to be conscious of what the norms are. It doesn't mean I wouldn't necessarily abide by them, but I might try to rebel against them. But there might be a penalty for me rebelling against them, and I might have to live with that penalty. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's not. It's the other way around. It's people that are. Sorry.
Go on.
So it's the people that are in this country, and that they've committed a crime, and then the punishment is that they're deported. Actually, their citizenship in their home country, their other country, so that they're being deported to, doesn't give them the same rights that they have as a citizen in the UK, and therefore actually.
So let me be tough. They should have thought about that beforehand. I can't tell you what happened. What happens is, there's this famous statement which is very unfair but true. One good Jew makes everybody think nicely about Jews. One bad Jew condemns all of the people. There is a rage and a racism in this country which we need to confront in all sorts of ways. But one of the ways is not necessarily to be tolerant of thoughtless people who jeopardise reputations. So I'm think of a specific example I'd give you, where the rage of the public, I know, has some mild justification. By which I mean, if they were Brits doing it, they would say lock them up. If they were non-Brits, they'd say, well, we can lock them up at our expense, or we can just deport them. Now, and of course, I mean, I was the Jew who argued against sending Abu Hamza to Jordan because I reminded people that despite the King Hussein went to, what's that place? Sandhurst. You couldn't get a professorship in Jordan unless you'd been approved by the secret police. So I do say there are occasions when you don't deport people, not because you shouldn't deport them, but because you can't guarantee what will happen to them when they get there. So I accept that as a possibility. But in general, I think people have to behave properly, and they certainly have to behave properly if they're visitors. But
that makes me hugely uncomfortable about the responsibility that one person has for everybody of a similar identity, and to me that feels really uncomfortable. But
we can talk about it.
Jane, as ever, I'm delighted that you're the Social Justice
Trying to
Lord
push
as
the
well.
boundaries so we don't agree with the time.
Yes. Ben.
I am a manager of the youth department here, one of the managers of the youth department here, and I am sort of surrounded by these young people who are very kind of engaged, but also who have grown up, who don't remember the 1990s, most of them weren't alive, and have only lived in this kind of fear-driven society, and and we're now seeing increasing numbers of young people voting, increasing numbers of young people going out on protests. I'm just wondering where you see the future of this issue going.
Yeah.
the citizenship issue or everything?
I mean, specifically
young people?
Citizenship issue, in terms of the kind of changing public opinion as a new generation comes of age, because they are a generation who haven't had a voice up until now.
Well, I mean, I might comment on that. What's truly scary is that the people who are in power now were young in the 60s. They were the free love and peace generation.
They were born, half of them.
That does require...
These cabinet ministers your age, not my age.
Well,
in their 40s. I wish they were in their 60s.
We're going back to 2002 with the Tony Blairs and the various people who opened the door to this new type of thinking and legislation. New Labour wasn't just New Labour. It was truly pernicious. A continuation of, let's say, for me, in terms of what Tony Blair did actually achieve, he took the fabric of society, cut it up, and sold it for cash. Right? That's basically what I see his role as having been done, and that was to open that up from what Margaret Thatcher had done before. The intangible benefits and the intangible importance of the relationships we have and how we look after each other is beyond calculation. It is beyond that. And to break that down and think that we can calculate on a penny by penny basis what we give to one another through state or through the big society is to lose the overall picture, the benefit of people wanting to come to this country. If we end up with a slippery slope to a Stasi state, really, where we're all asked through the prevent strategy to look at each other as if we're all extremists or potential extremists, then who would want to come here and who would want to live here? And we'll have a brain drain. It was already beginning to happen, and we'll have no value to it. There'll be no aggregate value to what's left of this society, really.
I'm going to outrageously use my chair privilege to allow myself to answer some of that too, Ben, because I worked on refugee resettlement in the summer of 2015, where Aylan Kurdi's body was washed up and put in the front cover pages. And I had colleagues who work, not for my organisation, but work in other organisations, monitoring ISIS's internal communications. And ISIS, I don't know how much you know about this, but have an incredibly elaborate set of, they have newsletters, they have communications. And one of the things that happened in the kind of September 2015, when Brits and Europe was turning towards the idea of welcoming in refugees, was that ISIS got very upset because they worried that the narrative that actually Europe might be welcoming would be really undercutting to people that they were encouraging to think would not welcome them, would never accept them. And my personal reflection, I want to be really clear, I'm not representing my own organisation here, is that when we as a nation sent a statement to Shamima Begum that she's not really us now, we are sending a statement that lots of other people want to believe, to encourage people to believe that young Muslim Brits are not really us, that there is a divide. And exactly the same groups that will make public statements against those groups end up encouraging other people to believe the messages that they are also saying completely inadvertently. And I think it's a really dangerous line when we draw lines between us and them, because there are lots of other groups of people trying to draw lines between us and them, whatever that means, and we end up feeding that message. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got room for one more question.
Can I just
Yes,
also add something to Ben? I mean, I think two, and there'll be many more than two, but two challenges I think which are important, and one is to help the Jewish community widen its definition of active citizenship and questions like poverty and inequality and the health service and everything else, because we need all of these things. And the second thing is this thorny question about citizenship when it relates to Palestine-Israel. I mean, and I think we all need help with that. I think the current government in Israel needs help with that. They may not see it that way, but I think we need to have some new thinking, and I would hope that future generations will help have some different sort of thinking than we've been able to give so far to that.
Can I just I want to say...
I feel like everyone's upping each other. Who can say the more radical thing? Go for it at this point.
I do want to say that I'm immensely hopeful for young people in this country. Yes, there are challenges. I don't happen to agree with you about Blair, but there are still other challenges independently of Tony Blair. But one of the reasons I'm involved in Syrian refugee stuff is because I want us to have a narrative that's like Canada rather than like Britain. If you look at the media and the whole narrative and the way that refugees and asylum seekers and people coming to the country are spoken about, it's entirely different. Now, if that can happen in Canada, I know they've got lovely polar bears and lots of ice and all sorts of other things that make it easier. Why can't it happen here? And it can happen here, but it needs people like you to do it. Not you personally, but you and your generation to do it.
But you personally as well.
The problem is, the case was never made for immigration. The case was never made why people should be. The case wasn't made for Europe. We had a twit of a prime minister who should have remained in his shepherd's hut before he ever came to be the prime minister, who announced he was going to have a Brexit. Referendum, which was never demanded except by the right wing of the Tory party. Wasn't even wanted by the people, but we got it. Then he was so stupid he ended up with the wrong result, because apparently he didn't want that result, according to some. And our current Prime Minister, and I won't say much about the Leader of the Opposition, about whom I also have some thoughts, played the hand that she was dealt with very badly. But nobody has made the case for Europe for the last 40 years. By the way, nobody made the case why, if we're going to have lots of more wonderful people in this country, we need to make sure we've got enough school places. I'm a councillor in Barnet. I've got people who haven't got schools, haven't got places in secondary schools. And it doesn't take very much, if they're not very bright, to think, well, hang on a minute, that person, who, by the way, he's brown, so maybe he's only been here 5 minutes, got the school place because he lived 3 doors away. Now, that isn't the answer. But our governments collectively, and here I would agree with you, have failed to provide an infrastructure in which we could make sure that people were welcome. And so suddenly, when we don't have nurses, people sometimes say, we should have had them here. Well, they'll be gone by then. Sorry, I've got to shut up.
I'm glad you voted for someone, but that was beautiful. One last question, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm going to try and do a positive question so we can end on one.
Radical.
I actually teach political literacy in schools, because I don't know if you currently know the curriculum isn't taught, and citizenship is taught, but I don't know how much you know about that. Now, that's part of what I want to talk about for the future. So when I go into schools and I mention citizenship, they don't really understand the concept. They don't know their human rights. They aren't taught that. That's also not taught anymore, what our human rights are, where we get them from. So we get them currently from the ECHR, Europe, and we're going to be moving away from that, potentially after Brexit. So that's another big issue about what's happening if we're going to move.
I love that this is your positive question.
But what would you like to see? The sort of, we're talking about the positive, we're talking about future generation, we're talking about the change. What would you like to see, potentially in an educational way, of this sort of shift, and how can we teach young people about these big concepts? You know, they're quite, you know, polarizing issues, and how would you like to see that embedded in sort of education-wise?
Beautiful question. I'm going to give all the panelists 30 seconds to answer it. Edie, you spoke about political education, so I'm starting with you.
Well, we just need it, I mean, and for adults as well. And, you know, with our fast-changing world, you know, we need to, you know, it's beyond sociology 101. We really, and that makes us better citizens. So 100%, and I'm really pleased to see there's some citizenship teaching still left. And
I went to a very small school. It had 200 people in it, and it was incredibly diverse in North London. And we had a fairly interesting headmaster who introduced discussion or current affairs discussion. So he also did religious education. One of the homeworks was prove that your God is the right God by next week, really. So yeah, and
everybody failed. Didn't they?
We had some interesting answers. But the idea that you make your students read the newspapers and discuss it and debate it every week bound us together in a way that I haven't seen in other schools. And I think that should be compulsory.
I mean, I think the danger is we're giving schools everything to do that we failed to do. I think the real challenge for teachers is every time there's a problem in society, sex education, let the teachers do it. Citizenship, let the teachers do it. And they're overwhelmed with stuff. And somehow I think we've got to get back to families and parents, helping parents and families, some of whom are struggling with poverty and struggling with jobs and struggling with mental health. We have to try and help them help their children to understand what it is to be a citizen of the world. And that, to me, is what your generation of teachers might be able to do.
Before we end, I just want to say one word about hot potatoes. We've talked this evening about living in increasingly divided times. And I think often there are two responses to really difficult conversations. One is when it's difficult, we just avoid them. And the other is we have them in a really poor tone. And for me, liberal Judaism is doing something extraordinary in modelling how are we going to have the really difficult conversations and do it in a way that is respectful and decent. So I want to first of all thank our hosts of liberal Judaism for tonight. But there's two people who do so much of the work on these conversations behind the scenes. And I'm going to ask you to join me in giving them a round of applause. It's Tom and Izzy. They've worked on this for weeks. I know because I keep getting their emails. So please can we say a huge thank you to Tom and Izzy. Even have the last word as it tells us about the next event in the series.
I love how you say I'm behind the scenes.
And literally in front.
Sure. Thank you all for being part of this. Sorry, this way. Oh. Thank you all for being part of this evening. You're wonderful questions. Now I'm standing in front of them.
A very special thank you to Charlotte, who marshalled these guys through their 3 minutes with authority.
5 in the case of the lawyer.
Well, that was not my timing, so that's my fault. And thank you again to Edie, to Tasnime, and to Danny as well for being wonderful panellists. And thank you guys for your questions. It was really superb. Lovely to see as well that liberal Judaism isn't just the home for your Jewish story, but the home for all sorts of stories. Happy with that? Just wanted to draw your attention as well to the flyers on your seats that are for our day of celebration coming up on the 23rd of June. And also to our next hot potato, which will be in September, currently the 19th of September, which will be about Jewish schools and faith schools and their role in society. Whether they're a good thing, bad thing, up to you. Come along, have your piece, say your piece. Anyway, thank you all. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you again next time.
And can we give our applause to my wonderful co-panellists? It takes serious courage to put yourself up